My name is Vinayak Charturvedi. I teach here at UC Irvine in the history department. My area of specialty is modern South Asia. So as I was thinking about some of the preliminary sort of thoughts and comments regarding the title of the panel, Between Empires, Struggling for Self-Rule in Imperial Conflicts, sort of many different kinds of thoughts and many different kinds of ideas and many different kinds of literatures kept coming to mind, and thinking about how I would conceptualize this idea of between empires. So a couple questions that I do have for the panel are about the categories of both self-rule and thinking about being in between, and whether this was a small ploy by both Amy and Jeff to open up the conversation in ways, in the multiple meanings of the word between, but also the multiple meanings of what self-rule is. And in a sense, thinking through the kind of discussions we've been having since yesterday, sort of actively now thinking about sort of the dominant form of self-rule in the 20th century and 19th century regarding nationalism was something that kept coming to mind, right? Was this the primary form of self-rule that we need to consider? Are we sort of in, there were many theorists who had argued that we were now in a post-nationalist world back in the 80s and 90s. And then also thinking about whether nationalism in and of itself is a form of imperialism. And sort of you have an emergence of a whole body of work that engages with the links between nation formation and imperial formation as simultaneous processes. And then another set of works by individuals working on state formation who argue that you can't really have any form of state formation without internal colonization, right? And we can think of works going back to Eugene Weber's From Peasants to Frenchmen, to works by James Scott in Seeing Like a State, in which he's making these kinds of claims as well, right? So I'm sort of, in my mind, sort of grappling with the whole series of things. And then the panelists all work on very, very different kinds of both imperial and national formations, and also different forms of self-rule. So I don't want to claim that self-rule is only articulated through nationalism. That's not what I'm claiming at all, but it seems to be the dominant form in sort of the modern world. So again, I will say very little at this point. I'll turn it over to our speakers. First, we have Holly Guise, who's enrolled in UPOC, and she's an assistant professor of history at the University of New Mexico. Her research focuses on gender, Unangak's relocation camps, Alaska Native activism and resistance, and indigenous military service during the war. Her monograph, World War II, Alaska, Native Voices and History, is forthcoming by the University of Washington Press. Our second speaker is Vincente Rafael, who's a professor of history and Southeast Asian studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. His research and teaching have focused mostly on the comparative political and cultural history of the Philippines, the United States, and Southeast Asia. He is the author most recently of The Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte in 2022. Our third speaker is Jeffrey No. He is a PhD candidate in history at Georgetown University. His dissertation project is an international history of both people refugee crisis and 3 Indochina wars more generally, that illuminates the long trajectory of Vietnam-Hong Kong relations. His research explores questions of sovereignty, law, immigration, and human rights. His essays have been published in Time, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the New York Times, among other publications. And our fourth speaker is Omer Bartov. He's the Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He's the author of 10 books and the editor of several additional volumes. His recent publications concern Eastern Europe and Palestine, Israel, Erased 2007, Anatomy of Genocide 2018, Tales from the Borderlands 2022, and Genocide, the Holocaust in Israel, Palestine, forthcoming later this year. So now I'll turn it over to our speakers. Holly.
Sure. Thank you very, are we on? Okay, can you all hear me okay? Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'd also like to thank Dr. Jeffrey Wasserstrom for inviting me today, and I'd like to thank all of the coordinators here at UCI and my fellow panelists. Okay, so I focus on Alaska history, and I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm Miowak, so I'm Alaska Native, and my family comes from Unalakleet, which is a village just a little bit south of Nome, so northwestern Alaska. And oftentimes when I hear about Alaska in the national news, it is for three reasons. One reason is tourism, right? Everybody has their tourist stories of Alaska, visiting the Inside Passage, going on a cruise. This is actually not a new story. It's been going on since like the late 19th century. So we have the tourism stories about Alaska. The other stories we have about Alaska include the imperialism stories, right? So like the Chinese bomb balloon that was shot down within the past week or so. And as we also learned about in the panel earlier today, the Japanese bomb balloons, the 9,000 during World War II, that a lot of them crash landed in Alaska and on the west coast of the Pacific. And then the other reason that Alaska is also in the news is usually it has to do with oil, right? So environmental history of Alaska and oil and what is happening. So we can see how there's certainly a settler colonial narrative in terms of how Alaska is perceived, either as a territory or place to be visited for tourist enjoyment, right? Kind of like Hawaii, or how it is seen as a valuable asset for US military purposes, or how it is seen as a place to extract resources for capitalism, right? Whether it's oil or kind of encroaching on the landscape and encroaching on native lands. So with that being said, I'd like to just center this story of Alaska to really focus on how Alaska Native people are interacting with these different narratives and these forms of settler colonialism that are continually taking from their land and from their resources, right? Like it's been happening for hundreds of years now. So in teaching at University of New Mexico, I try to include these Alaska narratives with my Native American history classes. And students are often surprised to learn about the sequential colonialisms of Alaska, from Russian occupation and the Russian fur trade in the 18th and 19th centuries to British whaling. Good grief, what? How did they get all the way over there? To British whaling, to basically US occupation after 1867, the same year that Canada becomes a country. Isn't that interesting, right? So, and right after the US Civil War. So we have this way that the US is becoming an empire and reaching north and reaching to the Arctic and to the North Pacific and expanding west across the Pacific at this time. And then, of course, we also have hostilities in the 20th century with Japan's invasion of the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska in June of 1942, followed by the Battle of Attu in May of 1943, where the US forces and Canadian forces reclaimed the island of Attu from Japan. And then we have these hostilities between the Soviets and the US in the 20th century. So I do want to open it up for more conversation with my colleagues. And so I'm just going to stop right there with a brief recap of that.
Yeah, Vincente.
Oh, okay. Right. Thank you, first of all, for inviting us all here. It's been such a marvelous conference. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. And the nice thing about being in a later panel is that you get to build up on a lot of comments and insights from the earlier speakers, which is what I did this morning. I got up early and I decided to put together some notes for today. And one of the things that stuck with me were two comments from yesterday. One was from Samuel Moyne, who said that we should try to arrive at some sort of working definition of empire and imperialism, and another was from Howard French, who said something about, who raised the possibility that is there something universal? Is there a universal structure of empire, imperialism? And so I thought about that for a little bit. And what I did, as I usually do in a lot of my work, is I go back to the word, and I go back to the linguistic origins of the word. So if you look at imperialism, of course, it comes from emperor, and emperor in turn comes from the Latin imperare, to command, the imperator is the commander-in-chief, and after 400 CE, with the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, emperor comes to be associated with the notion of sovereign, that is to say, the absolute ruler. And I think that is very important, and somebody mentioned this the other day, that the question of Christianity is an important consideration when thinking historically about empire. Why? Because of the fact that Christianity has this important sort of structuring effect on imperialism. First of all, it brings with it the notion of monotheism, which among other things centralizes the belief system while seeking to suppress others unlike it into a kind of hierarchy originating from and returning to a divine origin. Secondly, Christianity brings with it a model of governance that is shaped around this idea of pastoral practice, right? So that pastoral practice means that the pastor in this case cares not only for the entire population, but for each and every one in that population. So there's that relationship of intimacy, and not just a kind of impersonal coercion that goes with conversion and that goes with pastoral governance. Something to return back to Jonathan's notion of hegemony, that in some ways is a very, very Christian notion. And finally, Christianity entails what Foucault calls the conduct of conduct, right? Power comes through the shaping of conduct, not simply through coercion or not simply through force, but through convincing others that their conduct redounds to the benefit of everyone if it is shaped in a particular fashion. So Christianity brings, the last thing that's important about Christianity in relation to imperialism is it brings with it the imperative of planetary expansion in the name of universal redemption. Right? There is nothing foreign in Christianity. Everyone must be converted. Everyone in the world must be converted. So they have a totalizing mission of converting each and every human being, right? And to prepare everyone essentially for the second coming and for the final judgment. And this global mission of Christianity required material support from the state, Iberian states principally. The state in turn relied on Christianity to justify and rationalize its global conquest and colonization. So here we have the idea of imperialism as absolute sovereignty. That is to say, the sovereign is he who, acting like God, decides on the exception. The sovereign sets the law and so he set laws. There is therefore in imperialism, especially as it is structured by Christianity, the beginnings of what we might think of as modern authoritarianism. That is to say that it not only brings a kind of civilizational imperative, but by doing so precisely, it offers the promise of redemption subtended by attempts to exercise a kind of pastoral. So that's number one. Number two, given the absolutist vocation of imperial rule, it exists as a kind of impossibility, but an impossibility that sets the condition for its possibility. In what sense? Insofar as it can never achieve, like all absolutist claims, it can never achieve its goal. So imperialism we can think of as bound to fail, right? At least on its own terms. As some historians have observed, imperialists are usually the best grave diggers. But the death of imperialism only ensures its return. Its ghosts continue to haunt the planet. It continues to spectralize the present. So the failure of imperialism, in a way, assures its success, as it is constantly rediscovered, reinvented, and redeployed, as we see today. Another example, more immediate example, for example, decolonization in the global South that occurred after World War II. Decolonization opened the doors for, in some ways, their recolonization through the Cold War. The devastation of the war made economic aid essential for the newly independent countries. So, for example, the United States, which would come in and provide aid in various parts of the world. So decolonization, despite its dreams of autonomy and freedom, also assured, in some ways, the return of the imperial repressed, this time in much more complex, much more technically refined ways. One result is that the globalization of the modern state, as we come to experience it today, comes in and through the repurposing of technologies of empire. One can argue that there is no modern state which isn't also, to a greater or lesser extent, an imperialist state. 3, imperialism is a kind of practice of governing that is productive of certain kinds of power relations and certain kinds of subjects. To study imperialism is to understand these power relations. Now, such power relations are at once, I think Judy made a point of saying this, these power relations are at once impersonal as much as they are intimate. They are impersonal in the sense that they come from on top, in and through state apparatus, but at the same time, they're extremely intimate and come in the form of everyday practices and everyday experiences, from schooling to healthcare, welfare, taxation, leasing, parenting. All of these have some sort of imperial taint, which we experience to a lesser or greater extent. At the same time, imperialism, in cultivating these power relations, also sets the ground for their resistance. Indeed, one can think that there can be no empire without anti-empire, without, that is, reversing and displacing the imperial. 4, however, if imperialism returns and persists, it does so because it is also a form of desire. That is, the desire to be modern, to be Western, to accumulate capital as a way to freedom, the desire to dominate others, and the very condition for creating and containing otherness itself. Imperialism, unlike the nation state, has its own spatio-temporal order. With empire, borders are never clearly defined. Given its expansive existence, there is no empire, by the way, that is not expansive, and its tendency towards warfare of some sort to secure domination, the space of empire will always be elastic, unsettled, so that its existence is bound to be unsettling to those who encounter it and to those who find themselves enclosed by it. Imperialism, therefore, also has its own temporality. That is, as with the time of capitalist accumulation, empire regards time as infinite and never ending, whereas the nation seeks to punctuate and puncture imperial time. You know, when I always think of Jesse Jackson in one of those demonstrations, that if you've seen Eyes on the Prize, he's got this wonderful scene. He says, "What time is it?" And everybody yells, "It's nation time, it's nation time," right? So there's this idea that the nation comes at a punctual, precise moment in a way that empire never does. Empire always creeps up, right? Finally, so existing outside the space and time of the nation, the proponents of empire see it as exception. Imperial exceptionality is therefore intrinsic to its absolutist location. You cannot have absolutism unless you have exceptionalism. Finally, number 5, there is no such thing as resurgence of empire. Only, which is why the title for this conference is in some ways a misnomer. There is only the persistence and mutation of empire, to the extent that it is a defining and enabling condition of our modernity, whoever we are. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're caught in this sort of weird kind of, well, how can we get out of it? Well, maybe we can't, to the extent that we want to claim our modernity. It's very difficult. At the same time, and this is where I'll end, there is no end to anti-imperialism insofar as it seeks to limit imperialism, to counter its movements, to hold its proponents accountable, seek justice for the cruelties and violence perpetuated in the name of imperialism. So, as I said, we cannot speak of the resurgence of imperialism without also talking about the resurgence of anti-imperialism. So,
Hi. Okay. So, I'm happy to be here, and actually it's weird. I should just hold the mic. Yeah, I'm happy to be here, and thanks the organizers for putting it together. listening to the conference so far yesterday and throughout today, I was keep typing up notes and thinking, okay, I should respond to this because this relates to what I want to say about Hong Kong and that, and I realized that that is quite impossible because of just how much our conference has touched on so far, and the good leads that we can point to anyone and it can lead to further conversations. So I think it's a caveat to be on a panel later in the conference because there's just a lot that I could a lot of different directions that I can go to. So hopefully my remarks now and comments later can address some of those. I'll start by saying that there's no consensus among historians about the origins of our present world order. Westphalian sovereignty is rooted in 1648. And some would point to the American Revolution or the French Revolution as an important turning point, and still others will argue that border nationalism was a distinctly 19th century phenomenon. Whichever case that it is, the transition of an international system from one based on empires to one based on nation states clearly did not happen overnight in 1945. The lead up to it was very protracted. And it's pretty clear that the tail end of it is as well, because we are all living through that transition today. And in my case, which is my research thus far has focused on Hong Kong, and that's also where I'm from. The experience of Hong Kong speaks to that as well. For a long time, the lived experiences of Hong Kongers have been scorned by orthodox accounts of the city-state's past. The pro-Chinese view in general, propagated by nationalistic writers and through official government channels, depicts a peaceful ancient civilization minding its own business until foreign hostilities became insurmountable. And Hong Kong was taken by brute force, and in fact, the very starting point of the so-called century of humiliation. And in that view, the 1997 handover is framed as a matter of transitional justice. The pro-British view, on the other hand, concedes that the initial seizure of Hong Kong was ill-advised, but goes on to take great pride in how much 152 years of so-called benevolent governance have left the territory a much better place when it was found, on the eve of the so-called return to China. In reality, however, Hong Kong was shaped and reshaped many times over by empires competing with one another. Not just the cliche that Hong Kong is caught between China and Britain, as much as there's a lot of truth to that, but also thinking about how Hong Kong has historically been shaped by others like the Manchus, the French, the Japanese, the Soviets, the Americans, and of course today the Chinese as well. The very creation of Hong Kong in the mid-19th century resulted from the various clashes between inherently expansionist empires in the Pacific. And when I say that, I don't mean, of course, that there's no pre-colonial past to Hong Kong. Of course, there is. But the creation of Hong Kong as a distinct political entity arose from that dynamic that I just described. And when we centered the experience of Hong Kongers, we realized that the decades-long struggle for democracy and self-determination, which peaked in the period between 2014 and 2020, is one of survival in a world dictated by great power politics. I think we should now consider the idea of imperialism in China, which Jeff Westerstrom actually introduced this morning at 9 o'clock. And we think about this term, in Chinese history for so long it's used to describe, as he said, European imperialism and European imperialism only. This framework was popularized in the 1960s and 70s, largely by the New Left. Post-colonial theory is really based on binaries, the colonizer versus the colonized, or a period of colonization versus a period after colonization. But since our profession, the history professions, transnational turn in the 1990s, when we begin to incorporate more comparative perspectives, it's increasingly clear that the old tropes are frozen in time. The plight of the Uyghurs under Xi Jinping and the crushing of Kashmir amid a resurgence of Hindu nationalism serve as reminders that communities that have historically been on the receiving end of European aggression can also be perpetrators of imperialism today in the 21st century world. Recent scholarship, again, mostly in the historical profession, has shown that the Qing Empire wasn't so much a Chinese dynasty as it was a Central Eurasian imperial project of which China was a part. We can consider this when we think about the Manchu conquest of Taiwan, of Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, etc. And well into the 1870s, the Qing Empire was still intruding, for instance, into the Korean Peninsula. Just as the French didn't stop becoming an empire just because Napoleon III happened to have suffered defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, the Manchus did not stop becoming imperialists after losing the Opium Wars. In fact, the subsequent clash, and I like to use this example, in the middle of the 1880s between the Third Republic and the Qing, by this point under Empress Dowager Cixi, was a textbook example of an imperial conflict between a rising power and a declining one. On one side, having already colonized Cochin China and Cambodia, wanted to expand the Indo-Chinese Federation northward into Annam and Tonkin, and the other side wanted to preserve its existing sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. Much like the lost cause narrative about the US Civil War that emerged after Reconstruction to retroactively claim victimhood, this kind of narrative was not propagated when the Confederacy actually existed or immediately afterward, but much later, decades later. And Adam earlier made a good point about how China today, if you look at the map, is basically a resurgence of the Qing Empire, except I would say notably the cases of Taiwan, of northern Mongolia, which is an independent state, and outer Manchuria, which is part of Russia. The PRC has been the most successful in terms of recreating that empire, but I would say that it wasn't the first to do so. In fact, this kind of idea of creating a Chinese nation state based on the Manchu Empire was endorsed and revised by subsequent 20th century Chinese nation builders. And so when we think about the idea of unequal treaties, for instance, or the idea that vast stretches of inner Asia has been in the late alienable parts of China, as if China has not also been changing concepts throughout millennia, emerged largely in the 1910s. And this is very relevant to the case of Hong Kong, because the first time when a Chinese government, in this case the Peiping government, demanded on the international stage that Hong Kong belong to China, was actually in the Paris Peace Conference. Around the same time after the First World War, when the Third Republic of France demanded Alsace-Lorraine from Germany. And so we can see in sort of comparative perspective that this kind of demand as a result of World War I of territory based on an earlier configuration of an empire, how the case of China or Hong Kong can be placed into a broader context of other imperial experiences. I know my time is up soon. I'll take like 30 more seconds to say that we've talked about how authoritarian regimes today manipulate historical narratives to legitimize themselves. And in the case of China, often is the conflation of a broader cultural tradition with nation state, the myth of racial homogeneity, and victimhood as a supposedly unique experience. And so when we begin to think about the most existential challenges to China today, of course, there are your public health challenges, economic challenges, challenges to education, demographics, etc. But the most existential ones are issues dealing with territory. Think about the experience of the Uyghurs, what's going on in Southern Mongolia, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Macau, etc. And when we begin to do so, we can see how the legacies of imperialism continue to echo well into the 21st century. Thank you.
So, can you hear me?
Has to be closer, that's all.
Okay, how's that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for hosting this conference. Thank you to my co-panelists. Like Vincente, I got up early this morning and spent 2 hours trying to write a comment for 3 minutes because this was the instruction we got. So I did do that, but I may give myself a little bit more latitude, maybe a minute or two over that. Just in response to our chair's opening comment, there was a book published about 10 years ago by Alexander Prusin, who unfortunately passed away, called Between States. And it was about an area that I spent a fair amount of time researching called Galicia, or Galicia, which is now West Ukraine. And it was between states, it really was between empires. It was part of the imperial structure that I mentioned later on. And one of the strange experiences I think that we've had in the last 20 years or so is how the history that we thought we left behind has returned. I don't know if we can call it resurgence or return, but that people like myself feel that something that we thought had disappeared, first the nation state, which was supposed to be withering away, and secondly the empire, and the empire in particular in the case of Ukraine. So when I teach a class now on World War II or on the Holocaust, and I show maps to my students, suddenly now, which did not happen 2 years ago, they recognize all the names on the maps because they're watching CNN. Ukraine is suddenly back, and Russia is back in Ukraine. So that's just in terms of what you were mentioning. It very much resonated with me. I want to go back to Leah's eloquent account yesterday of her attempt to find truth in of what actually happened in her visit to the Albanian archive. Now that is something that as a historian I've done many times, looking for truth in archives. There is a certain excitement in that, of course, when you go to an archive and you pull out a document and you are in some ways back in that period. You are holding something that was written by someone at the time that the event you are researching occurred. But truth is not always what you find there. You find a whole variety of truths. What I was reminded of was Franz Kafka's story Before the Law. That idea that you wait there in the archive hoping to find some truth, and there is no truth, just as you wait before the gate of the court to find justice, and you never find any justice. You are simply sitting and waiting there. Now, Kafka was depicting, among other things, the anonymous, faceless, and soulless Habsburg Empire's bureaucracy, where justice could not be found. It was not about that. In that sense, Leah's Albanian archive, I thought, was twice removed from Kafka's world. First, by the post-World War I nation states, and second, by the post-World War II communist states. The archive that she visited was a post-communist Albanian archive. And this takes me to something that I want to evoke here that has to do with my own work. In his great 1939 novel, and I don't know how many of you know it, I'd be curious, called A Guest for the Night. Has anyone heard of that novel? No? Omer Natal Alun, it's called in Hebrew. The only Hebrew language writer to have received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1966, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, describes an encounter in World War I Vienna between a former anarchist and the former socialist leader called in the novel Knabenhut. It's an interesting name. I can talk more about why he's called that. The dying leader's last words, and again, this is in Vienna in World War I, are the following. He says, "The generation that is about to come will be worse than all the generations that preceded us. the world is becoming ever uglier, uglier than either I, the socialist leader, or you, the anarchist activist, ever sought to make it. Knabenhut's character is actually based on a real historical figure whose name, and again, unknown to most people, Anselm Moslem, who established a socialist cell in pre-World War I Buchach. What is Buchach? Buchach is a Galician town where both Agnon and my mother were born, and whose entire Jewish population was murdered in World War II by the Germans and their local Ukrainian collaborators. Mosler had tried to join the Austrian and Polish social democracy, then organized Ukrainian peasant strikes in the early 1900s, and died of tuberculosis in Vienna during the Great War. He died actually from tuberculosis that he contracted in a Russian jail when he was arrested years earlier for distributing pamphlets in the Russian Empire. And when he died, he was forgotten by all, apart from Agnon, this writer, who recalled the moment when Buchach, that little town in East Galicia, became the theater of a struggle between socialists and Zionists, both groups being largely Jewish, because this town was largely Jewish. So I give you the story as an introduction to some points or ironies that I want to point out. They're just 5 points. And I think that they are relevant to our panel on Between Empires. The first is that in the aftermath of the Spring of Nations of 1848, the revolutions of 1848, the multi-ethnic and multi-religious Austrian Empire emancipated the Ukrainian serfs and the Jews, most of whom, both the Ukrainians and the Jews, lived in Galicia, in a province, the northeasternmost province and the poorest province of the Austrian Empire, which Austria annexed from Poland in 1772. But I won't go into all that. So they emancipated these two groups. This liberation, this emancipation, led to the creation of two nations, the Ukrainian nation and the Jewish nation. Not the Jewish people, but the Jewish nation, the modern Jewish nation. Thanks to the efforts of generations of zealous and increasingly ruthless nationalizers who were very active in this area. This was an area where nationalism was being formed. World War I began in the East as a war between empires, between multi-ethnic empires, but ended up creating a series of nation states with large and unwanted national minorities. So just as an example, Poland, which disappeared as a state at the end of the 18th century, is resurrected in 1918 as a Polish nation state. But only 60% of the population of Poland are ethnic Poles, Roman Catholics, which in Poland is more or less same. And the rest are mostly 20% are Ukrainian, 10% are Jews, and then there are others, the Russians, Lithuanians, Germans, and so forth. Now, the final unmixing of these groups, that is, the creation finally of homogeneous ethnic states, is accomplished only in the course of and in the aftermath of World War II, courtesy of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. That is, policies of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and population policies of deportations. And finally, Zionism, which I mentioned before as one of the two forces in that little town of Buchach that Agnon and my mother came from, Zionism exported the notion of territorial ethno-nationalism from Galicia, where the Jews did not claim any territory, but led the idea of ethno-nationalism to Palestine. And it remains to this day the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is something that we can talk more about. And the last thing I want to say, just because of the previous very interesting lunchtime lecture, is that in the 1960s, a novel was published in Israel called To Remember and to Forget, Lizkor v'Lishkoach. And it's mostly a forgotten novel. But I like it a lot. And it was written by a journalist called Dan Amos, who previously was known as Tilgenzuber, a very sort of Jewish name from the diaspora, who was a child Holocaust survivor and transformed himself into a heroic Israeli soldier in the war of 1948, and later on became a major peace activist in Israel. And the novel is really about what do you remember and what do you forget, and how the erasure of his previous identity as a child survivor of the Holocaust into this the stereotype of the Israeli Sabra recurs or comes back to him as something that has to be resolved only in his middle age, and how that is the beginning of opening a path to reconciliation in that region, if you like, going against the logic of ethno-nationalism. So I'll stop here, thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
I wanted to draw Professor Guise. Welcome back to Irvine, by the way. She was a postdoc here. I wonder, you've been doing your oral histories with elders, and I just wonder, what do you think they would think of as sort of markers of the moments that really mattered? What would they think, do you think, of some of this conversation of being
Yes.
trapped between? How would they
Yes.
articulate it?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for that question. You know, there's an interesting kind of concept I like to apply when teaching is like the zoom out interpretation and then the zoom in interpretation. So the zoom out would be like, how can we critically understand like these empires and the structures that they impose, and this global capitalism and racial hierarchies that are generating indigenous bodies into quote savage others, right? And we see this happening over several centuries and continuing into the 20th century. And then there's the zoom in interpretation. So like, what is the social history? What are the oral histories of the people who actually remember the war, right? And that's certainly a different story than just the number of Native people relocated to internment camps during World War II by the US government, right? The Unanga, the Aleut, 880 relocated to allegedly protect them from invasion by Japan after Japan invaded the Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska, taking about 40 Attuan prisoners of war to Hokkaido on the North Island of Japan. So we have all these stories of like forced migration as well during this time period. This is also happening during other types of forced migrations of indigenous bodies, the boarding schools, right? In terms of 20th century US history. So to talk about empires and to talk about imperialism, yes, we can certainly talk about the influence of Russian colonialism, Soviet war tactics during the 20th century, during the Cold War with the US hostilities, Japan's invasion, good grief, Spanish voyages even went to Alaska, like at some point. So there's all of these colonial influences, right? But in terms of how Alaska Native people talk about this time period today, what is impacting a lot of these lives is actually the US colonization projects. In terms of settler colonialism, continually taking indigenous lands, not recognizing indigenous sovereignty, trying to actively remove Native sovereignty, imposing the corporate structure of Alaska Native corporations onto Alaska Natives in the 1970s during this time to seize oil from Alaska, right? And then there's even like the personal histories, like I struggle with whether I was even going to bring this up today or not, you know, but I think it's an important story to share. So my mother's from the village of Vinayak, which is, again, I think when she was a child in the 1950s, there were probably no more than 300 or 400 people in this Vinayak village, right? Now there's maybe about 1,000. Now, according to oral history, she has also said at some point that like a Russian spy was actually a teacher in that village during the Cold War era, right? So we have these Alaska Native stories about these hostilities between the Soviets and the US, but then more so, there is a book that came out about the US Air Force conducting experiments on children to test their thyroids with radioactive iodine to see how Inuit people could survive cold climates. And my mother was part of that group, okay, pulled out of a classroom where the teacher was taught by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? So a government official, a government agent, pulling my mother without consent, without parental approval in the 50s, injecting her thyroid with iodine, and she has since had to have her thyroid removed, right? So these stories about empire and imperialism are also very personal when you have family members yourself who were part of these medical experimentations who did not receive an apology yet. And we cannot find those records as of yet. So I don't know, I didn't mean to just dump on you all, right? But again, like psychologically, it actually is a pressing issue in terms of what is happening to our communities today and the grievances. And yes, there's a lot of resistance, but how much more resistance do we have, right?
Thanks. So in listening to the papers and the other conference presentations, I mean, it struck me as someone who was an undergrad and grad school at the rise of post-colonial studies in the late 80s and early 90s, to the kind of conversations we're having today. Whereas with the emergence of post-colonial studies, one of the things, and the rise of studies on nationalism, especially anti-colonial nationalism, meant that there was a great moment of optimism, hope, and celebration of the ending of formal empires, right? And fast forward to this week and today, it's kind of hitting me very rapidly in terms of, especially Jeffrey's statement, who is a grad student right now, where post-colonial studies is kind of reduced to a binary, which is very interesting to me, sort of someone who's engaged with some of these conversations and debates, of the lack of complexity that's being raised, right? And I think Holly's comment right now also made me think of something else related to that the problem may not be with the people who are experiencing empire. The problem may be with those who are studying empire in terms of, and I'm sort of fast forwarding many thoughts in my head regarding post-colonial studies to kind of the demands for more complexity today, the resurgence of empires, whereas when we thought there was a moment of great optimism where formal empire had ended. And I'm just wondering whether, and then also Vincente's comment regarding that we can never get away from empire, and we can never get away from anti-empire, right? Anti-imperialism. And so I'm just beginning to wonder whether this is an ontological kind of condition that we have as humans, right? I mean, is it the case that we have to grapple with empire for the foreseeable future? We probably would all say yes. But if we look back historically in time, it's always been there too, right? So the question is, and I think Vincente's comment about nationalism as sort of, it makes its appearance as a form of self-rule, of challenging empire, but suddenly it becomes imperial in and of itself. And it reminded me of Lenin's kind of binary between anti-colonial nationalism and imperialist forms of nationalism, right? So in a sense, we're kind of forever bounded by this. And I was just kind of curious to get panel's responses to some of these comments. I've opened up many different comments there, but it's kind of to be provocative. I mean, is this a part of our human condition, right?
No, it's certainly, I mean, I think we're caught in this dialectic. Adorno would have no problem understanding this. It's an endless dialectic, which doesn't mean it doesn't change. It's changing all the time, right? But at the same time, there's a way in which it returns in all sorts of guises, all sorts of forms, I don't think there's a way that we can sort of claim a pure position outside of empire and say, hey, we're completely anti-imperialist, therefore we have the privilege to pronounce on the evils of imperialism. I don't think we can ever get there. If we think we can, then I think we're deluding ourselves to do so. To the extent that we're caught up in the history of modernity. I mean, interesting discussion about reparation and repair, right? When you start talking about reparations, then it leads you, and you can feel great about talking about reparations because you say, yeah, this is the right thing to do, this is the virtuous thing to do, this is the moral thing to do. But once you start doing that, Then you have to start thinking about institutions of redistribution. You have to think about sort of, how do we do this? Who runs it? What are the politics of this redistribution? And so forth and so on. So then you get caught up in these same questions, I think so. Yeah. Which is not to say we shouldn't do it. I mean, I think we should do it. But to do it with eyes wide open, is all I'm saying.
This is something I also think about and struggle with, like human nature, the human condition, when we're thinking about things like human rights. And the one kind of caution I have in terms of like labeling this as being the human condition is how it downplays or excuses settler colonialism and racial capitalism, right? And so just saying, well, it's just human nature. Well, there's actually like a structure of capitalism and also a racial hierarchy that's been created over several hundred years with settler colonialism. So I don't want that to just turn into, well, it's just human nature. I think that there was a very specific system, kind of a global system that was set up to extract from territories and resources of what we could call the third world and to create a racial order. And until that is upended, we'll continue to see the violence from colonialism as it perpetuates. And then in terms of how do we dismantle it, the system was created with violence. And so it's almost like you need counter violence or hardcore love. I don't know. I don't know which one, but the way it was put in place was through violence. And so how to respond to that, I don't have the answer, but.
Yeah, well, I don't have a lot of answers to those questions either, but I would just say, yeah, I think it's interesting to look at how, taking a more sort of theoretical approach, our understanding as scholars of questions of imperialism, it's just shaped so much by events in the news. And, you talked a moment ago about the moment of optimism, right? I mean, there were, after the period of decolonization, one moment of optimism, of course, was the formal end of the empire, and then the other one would be in the early 1990s, actually throughout the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, the triumph of the liberal international order. And, as someone who is currently in grad school and currently undergoing reading a lot of these texts, amid a world of so much trouble, optimism is not a word associated with events over the past couple of years since I was in the PhD program, right? So the way we think about, these issues obviously would be quite different, and so I think that the generational aspect of understanding these theories, I think, is an interesting point. And also, yeah, I mean, the point about binary, I think about these issues a lot, and I mean, even in terms of nationalism. I mean, nationalism and imperialism are not opposite sides of the same coin, right? There is the nationalism that is being used as a tool to fight against imperialism. As we've seen, throughout the Third World, after World War II, in various independence movements. But there is also nationalism as a tool to advance imperialism, and that's what the case I've been trying to make, thinking of China. The same students, and I've talked to Jeff about this before, the same students on May 4th in 1919, on the streets of Beijing and elsewhere, demanding the transfer of Shandong from Japan to China, were the same people who dismissed the independence of Mongolia and Tibet. And so it always depends on how you look at it, right? It's not, there's not always one side that's always imperial and one side that's always anti-imperial, but these change depending on the perspective. And I've had arguments with fellow activists, unfortunately some in jail today, but in Hong Kong, about how to how to fight against Chinese intrusion into our freedom and autonomy. And some people think the best way to fight Chinese nationalism is to prop up Hong Kong nationalism, and I don't agree with that, because I think fighting nationalism with nationalism doesn't always lead to very positive results. But how should what is the best way forward? I don't think I have the answer to it, and unfortunately, in the case of Hong Kong, for the past 2-3 years, those conversations aren't even legal because of the national security law. And so, I continue to think about these issues, but there's no good conclusion.
So you asked a really big series of questions, and I don't think there's any clear answers to them. But when we talk about injustice in the world, oppression, persecution, genocide, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, then it's very easy for all of us to sit here and say we're all against it, we all oppose it. Of course we do, and we should. And we should think of ways to work against it. It's nothing new, but it doesn't mean that you should accept it. I was thinking about the idea of empire and anti-empire along the lines of a mystical Jewish thought of the Kabbalah. In the Kabbalah, the idea is that God is everywhere. If God is everywhere, how come there's evil? So where does evil come? God has to make space for evil. God has to remove himself and leave space for evil. So evil, Satan, is called the Sifra Achra, the other side. There's one side is God and one side is evil. So the condition of the world is such, that doesn't justify it. That does not mean that you should not work against it. But that condition exists. It reminded me of a story about an ancient Egyptian poem that was found. It's apocryphal, it's not a real story, but this ancient poem was found, and the poet wrote, "What shall I write on that has not been written on yet?" And so this is something that always repeats itself. Settler colonialism, which is very much part of the modern era, has an ancient history. The ancient Greeks were settler colonists. They colonized the entire Mediterranean basin, right? And there was a great deal of injustice in that. That does not mean that we should not oppose it, but it also means that we have to understand that human beings have always organized themselves in empires or states or colonies and have always acted in unjust ways. And the idea that we sitting here would find a solution to that problem is more or less like the Kabbalah. So in that sense, I find this conversation a little frustrating because we are positioning ourselves as those who oppose evil. We are going to find some solution to something that hasn't been found, instead of speaking about particular specific issues, such as the case of Hong Kong. And there one can, not that I have a solution to that, but there one can actually speak practically about what can be done and what cannot be done. And what is the price for each action that you make, but paid by those who are actually taking these actions, rather than by some of us who don't pay any price at all.
Great. I wanted to open up to questions. Yeah, for you.
Should I use the mic? Yeah, you guys can hear me now.
Thank you. So I just wanted to respond a little bit to what Omer just said and build a little bit on what you were saying, Holly, to say, I mean, of course, the struggle for self-rule in the sense of self-mastery is perennial, and it's part of the human condition, and the struggle and humans organizing themselves in oppressive ways is the human condition, struggling against that is. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the the really new thing that started to unfold a few centuries ago, and what makes empire, the ancient empires, or the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Habsburg Empire, different from these later empires and the nation states that have been derived from them, is that the concept of sovereignty and the relationship to land was really different. I mean, there were overlapping later notions of sovereignty. Sovereignty was not something that could be commodified. Land often was not something that was commodified. And the minute that starts to happen, or when that process unfolds, and the kind of centering of material desire that follows after that, and this is getting back to the kind of Gandhian definition of what modern colonialism is about, then you're in a very different world that leads to the point of this very unique situation of existential crisis. We've always had empires, but we've never been on the verge of environmental collapse, right? So there is something very new that's happened in the last few centuries that is, historically specific. And I think it's really important to maintain a distinction between the kinds of empires. If today's China is looking at the Qing Empire and its geographical footprint, that's one thing, but we have to understand that the way the Qing Empire actually operated and is very different from the way the modern Chinese nation state / empire is operating. So yeah, that's just one of those. Thank you.
Yes.
So we've been talking about the empires that reinvent themselves and research and topic of the conference. But there have also been cases of empires that not just entrenched, but basically dropped out of the war system. Few people think of Sweden as one of those that it truly was. The question to all these wonderful historians is when, why, and how do empires retrench and drop out of the imperial system that we seem to be locked into, but perhaps not forever? Thank you.
Would you guys like to respond?
Yeah. I guess it would depend, and the answer to that would depend on the specific situation. I mean, you think of Scandinavia, in Sweden, Denmark, they were all empires at some point, and Finland, of course, was part of Russia, and so forth. They retrench or they retreat, but not completely. They still have remnants of their old imperial holdings or their old colonial holdings, and the way in which, again, it's a question of even if they do retreat in a territorial sense, they retain certain aspects of what you might think of as imperial technologies. The technologies of the state, right? They still retain some of that. So the retreat is never definitive. The retrenchment is never, once it's over, once and for all. It's modulated, right? It mutates. And right now, I think you see the surge, if you want to call it that, in the Scandinavian sort of situation with refugees and with immigrants, and the rise of the right, especially in a place like Sweden, which has a long history of fascism, right? The way in which Muslim immigrants and refugees have been treated. Denmark, pretty brutal, the way in which they get segregated. So despite what looks like a very, very sort of copacetic society, there are still those who are targeted and who are other, as it were, and treated as outsiders, which I think is a continuation of a certain kind of imperial relations. So it's never over.
Yeah, I as a non-specialist in Swedish history, I don't have much to comment on Sweden itself. But what I would say is self-determination is not a moment. We like to think of the practice of self-determination in the form of a referendum. And that's the most obvious, right? An independence referendum, for instance. But self-determination, I think, is an ongoing process based on consent and popular view, popular will. Sorry, not view, will. And so I think I honestly don't think even if a country today and it is morally questionable to say some there's no, I don't think there's such thing as like a good country, right? Because all countries have committed their share of problematic stuff. So I would say when we think of countries that are democratic, however, as a general rule, not absolute, but as a general rule, I think countries that have a democratic system are better positioned to protect the rights of minorities, and a lot of those minority groups are minorities because precisely of that imperial legacy. And I'm just thinking of Japan, for instance. I mean, the cliche is always that Japan has historically, for thousands of years, has been closed, is relatively racially homogeneous compared to Western countries. But the Meiji Restoration was quite recent. It occurred in the middle of the 19th century, and it was only after the Meiji Restoration that the Meiji state invaded Hokkaido and Okinawa, which in the context of the 19th century were also Japanese colonies. But we don't think of that. We don't think of those as Japanese colonies today so much, because I would argue that a more democratic system of government that actually allows citizens to express their views and again continue to be able to pick their government, choose their leaders based on consent. I think history is something that we can't change, but the system of government today is something that we can, and building a good system, a robust system of democracy, I think is the best and most realistic way to address some of those issues from the past.
Just one word on, also as a non-specialist on Sweden.
We have a room full.
Yeah, right. All of us here. So I was thinking about Sweden in relationship to Poland, and when you think about the legacy, the imperial legacy, Sweden, I think now perceives itself as a nation state. And as a nation state, what you find in Sweden, as you find in Poland today, as you find in most East European countries that, as I said earlier, finally managed to become homogeneous ethnically, which was their goal, they get very nervous about suddenly the threat of no longer being ethnically homogeneous. And that is what is being used now by the kind of political elements that we see all over Eastern Europe. If you lean back to, say, Poland's imperial past, and Poland also had an empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that legacy is non-homogeneous. It's a legacy of Ruthenians, Lithuanians, and Poles, as well as Jews. And so that is a non-nation state legacy. And there was a discussion in Poland in the 1930s, which had to do with expanding Poland to reach the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and include all those groups. Now, that doesn't mean that those groups actually wanted to be included. They didn't, but within Polish thinking, it was an empire that would be inclusive of different groups. So in that sense, when we talk about empire nation state in the 19th and 20th century, empire is not always or only the bad player. The nation states that appear after World War I are nation states that are geared to demographically engineer their populations, to reach out to where their ethnic brethren are and to kick out the foreigners in their midst. That is the core of the violence that then is also used by the larger imperial states such as Germany and the Soviet Union. So in that sense, I just think that we need to think of the relationship between state and empire in the modern period also through that prism of what is the alternative to empire. If it is the nation state has its own mechanism of oppression, exclusion, and violence.
Holly, did you want to respond? Yeah. I think we had a question here.
Do we have time?
Why don't we get questions from the
Yeah,
audience?
her hand was up first, so
Yeah.
yeah, please.
Is Judy? Judy needs a question.
We'll take all three questions and then,
Okay.
yes, yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much for everything that has been there. Is this on? Is this on? Very interesting and depressing day.
You're welcome.
One of the things that has been happening along the day is that we seem to be very generous in exchanging the concept of nation state with empire, which is something that makes me quite uncomfortable. Empire is a way of governance, and the national state is something completely different. And we should not be so generous at just using one term or the other, depending on how it validates our arguments. The empire is a way of government which actually emphasizes power and control over several elements of the nation state. The idea of nationality, the idea of government, the idea of territory, and overall, and beyond everything, the idea of population. So in reality, when we look back or forward or backwards or in the future, the empire has not disappeared because it's a way of governance by power and control, and it has only been transformed. And now in this sea of pessimism, but I have the feeling that academics we get very emotional with the whole evil and bad and let's fight and let's be good. And in reality, we are unable to manage our expectations. And I think we failed to point out something which is for me key in this transformation, if not disappearance of empires. And it's the population and the voice of the population. So true, we can consider that the modifications of these empires and the transformation from one to the other is actually due to certain banality of time. It just keeps on happening. But I truly believe that the voice of people and the transformation of societies has played a crucial role in this transformation. And I have not heard anything along the day, and I wonder if this fantastic panel could comment more on that.
We'll take the last couple of questions, and then panels have 1 minute each. For 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
This is gonna be very fun to watch. So Jeffrey threw into this already very complicated conversation a whole other categorical consideration called democracy, right? And I was actually stunned by, we can't debate about democracy in a day-long conference, state-of-the-art business. But I was stunned by a couple of your assertions. And you chose Japan as an example for what you're saying, and you even used the word vigorous. And I, as someone who's lived in Japan and worked in Japan as a journalist, I have never thought of Japan as a vigorous democracy. And it's a virtual one-party state, and the people of at least one part of Japan, which has come up in the conference today, definitely think that they are being occupied and controlled by an empire. And I think there's people in Hokkaido who think that way too. So I just want to say that there's something even sharper to say about this democracy concept, and that is, listen, we're sitting here in the United States. You said democracies are relatively good at taking care of the interests and needs of minority people. Listen, the United States was a slave republic for what portion of its history, and did not begin to recognize the rights in a meaningful sense of the portion of its population, and these are not the only people who were violated, but the portion of its population who were enslaved until my childhood, right?
And who were female.
Yeah, oh yes, I said there's other categories, absolutely, right? So I think this is a peculiar perspective that really needs to be addressed. And then just very quickly on the Finland thing, I thought that was a very productive observation. We don't have time to explore it in great depth, but the even livelier examples that come to my mind in light of that question are Spain and Portugal. Portugal was, I would argue, the first
Of course.
modern imperial
Of course.
state. And it was the last to give up the kind of geopolitical colonies, right? How do we think about them today? And I love your word of technologies and, and also the idea that there's no kind of sharp thing. We don't just stop overnight being an empire, but these are, I think, much more fertile examples even.
We have to finish this, so let's,
Yes.
maybe a few more comments.
Judy, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Judy. Sorry.
So if everyone can very quickly, 30 seconds.
Just very quickly, I think the question you raise is really interesting. Where does one find lines of flight, as it were, right, to use that popular term? I think you find it in art. I think you find it in literature. I think you find it in the imaginative products of those people who are committed precisely in sort of conjuring a kind of democratic life that is, if not outside empire, certainly that takes exception to the exception, that takes exception to the empire. I think that's where you find it in social movements. An interesting thing about imperial formations is they're never short of social movements. There's always social movements going on, right? Whether or not they fail, whether or not they accomplish anything, they leave a legacy that everybody else builds into. Perhaps next year, Jeff, when you do something like this, you could do something on social movements.
Holly.
Sure, okay, I'll go really quickly. I wanted to just touch on really briefly what Dr. Judy Wu said earlier about the islands being central to basically these empires in terms of holding power, establishing bases, and also like the indigenous peoples of these islands and like how they encounter war is very different. And they see war firsthand and it impacts their daily lives. And war does have these real environmental impacts. Like I really wish we could have talked about scorched earth tactics as well today, in terms of just decimating like genocides of people, of bodies, but also the decimation of the land. Those two go in hand. Somehow we need to work together to keep the human race alive and also the planet, but okay.
Yeah, I have only 30 seconds, so I'll try my best. When I think about the most robust democracy in Asia, at least I would say is Taiwan. I used the example of Japan because I was trying to think of a relatively stable democracy today in a country that used to be a very strong imperial power, at least in the recent past. And Japan struck me as one. And also I was thinking in terms of the countries most committed today to multilateralism. I think I would include Japan as one of them. But I don't mean to, in the case of Japan or in the case of the United States, to say, okay, these are good countries and other countries are bad. As I said in my previous remark, and of course the conversation will have to continue because this is such a huge topic, I was just proposing that a democratic system is more likely than an authoritarian system of government to rein in the excesses of imperial ambitions in the 21st century world. And if the point of comparison is with China or with Russia, I think the very fact that I, as a Hong Konger, can sit in this room at UC Irvine today as a public institution in the United States and say everything that I just did, and the fact that if I did the same thing in China and Russia, I would immediately be sent to jail. I think that speaks to at least some merit of the democratic system of government, and we should all do more to protect it. We should all do more to advance it. But I will defend it.
Could I just please say, I've been sitting here all day as a Polish person and dying to say exactly the same thing. Thank you very much.
So just one word, I want just to respond to the question of people, and I think people were missing a bit in our conversations. I just want to say that as a historian of the modern era, when you bring in people, you sometimes find that people can easily be led to harm others and themselves, to support the worst kinds of regimes, to turn against their neighbors. I wrote a whole book on that. And therefore, we have to talk about that, and we have to talk about democracy. Some of what came up today, such as in reparations, when a democratic state wants to decide on reparations, If it is a democracy, it has to ask the people. And the problem with that is that people often don't want to pay up. And then the question is, what do? Do you do away with democracy? Or do you not pay for the sins of the past? So in that sense, the people are not always, don't always go where we would
But we
like
have to
them
talk about it.
Yes.
Well, thank you to all the panelists.